That's all right. Hey, Matthew Frith, welcome to the NAC on Australia podcast.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much for having me.
Tariffs are in the news, and you have written an excellent doctoral thesis on the American protectionist movement and their thinking. How did you get interested in the subject matter at the beginning?
Basically, the reason why started digging in this area and just happened to keep finding more thinkers and more theories is uh, you've had quite a number of works which have been written to actually show that a lot of nations have used protectionist policies to develop. You may have come across the likes of Hadrian Chang's Kicking the Way of the Ladder and other works of that nature. And what you tend to find is there's a lot of economic history and political history showing this, but I was kind of interested in actually why were these governments following these protectionist policies. And in particular, when you look at American history, when you look at the Whig and Republican Party, it's a very clear. And in my thesis, I actually track the different administrations and tariff rates. It's pretty clear that when the Whigs get in, and just for the viewers, the Whigs were the predecessor of the Republican Party. So that was one of the founders of the Whig Party was Henry Clay, who
Mm.
I'm sure many of your thinkers would be aware that he came up with the American system, and one of the planks of that was protective tariffs. What you find is whenever the Whigs or the Republicans had control of Congress or the executive branch, you'd always tend to find that there was these massive hikes in tariffs. So I was kind of interested in what were the actual intellectual foundations of this. So not just looking at the intellectual history, a history of events, but the intellectual history of American protectionist thought. Um, and then you just, of course, one of the most well-known ones would be Alexander Hamilton with the Report on Manufactures and Friedrich List. But more and more, I just started uncovering more thinkers. I actually wrote my honors thesis on Henry Carey, who was effectively the leader of the school in the mid-19th century, so this American protectionist school of economics.
Mm.
Um, and it's just one of those things where you follow footnotes and those things, and you start uncovering more thinkers. And it turns out there was quite a lot. It was a very large school of thought in the United States.
I'm fascinated in this topic and know a lot of the names that you mentioned already, but you've gone deep. You've followed more footnotes than I could ever dream of. What though, in summary, do people need to understand about the American protectionists?
Um, I guess when you look at actually the underlying reasoning behind tariffs, essentially why I spent the time writing the thesis is that um, what you actually find in the secondary literature is it's very dismissive of the protectionist writers. The common line is that they were basically unoriginal. They were taking a lot of the ideas of the classical economics and basically just arriving at different policy conclusions, but not really. They didn't really develop a an original system of political economy. That's what you actually find in the secondary literature. I argue that that's actually false, and that the protectionists actually they started off with different theoretical foundations, and it was actually because of these different assumptions and axioms, which differed from the classicals, that they arrived at their differing policy conclusions. And I think one of the main things is actually how dynamic their economic thought is. When you look at the classical literature, it's mainly focused on capital accumulation. So these static increases in capital or a restructuring of economic resources. You get that in David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. When you actually look at the American protectionists, what they're interested in is uh, they see that the main driver of growth is actually human ingenuity and invention. So they talk a lot about, you'll hear the terms come up whenever you read their works. They'll talk about the inventive genius or the inventive faculties, those sorts of things. So I think that's one of the main things, just their emphasis on invention and human ingenuity. So part of the reason for actually protective tariffs is actually to allow individuals to exercise their inventive faculties and give them breathing room to experiment and engage in new economic pursuits. And the other thing which is very overlooked, even in the literature on Hamilton, is there's this emphasis on a diversity of talents and dispositions that distinguish different individuals from one another. So there's this emphasis on individuality in the American protectionist thought. And what you tend to find, there was obviously these thinkers supported the infant industry argument, but it actually runs deeper than that. They actually argued for a permanent, especially the later thinkers such as Henry Carey, was actually, they were arguing for a permanent tariff to encourage economic diversification and to maintain economic diversification so that individuals can actually basically enter employments that are most congenial to them. You know, if you have a particular natural aptitude for, going into textiles or something, then if you have that industry, you can go into it. Where if you specialize according to free trade, then you have these certain talents and inventive genius that's or a disposition towards a particular industry. You're effectively locked out of those industries if you're specializing.
I like that point. I mean, because it occurs to me I'm based in Brisbane, but if someone's interested in cars and they have talents, tinkering and building things, they can't get involved in that industry. They used to be able
Yeah,
to get involved in that industry. It existed, but now it's all been shipped offshore. So you had previously had generations of people who worked in that industry, and grandfather would come home and talk to the father, and the knowledge would be accumulated and passed down, and there would be those aptitudes would be rewarded because they would have something of industrial application to get involved in. Look, it's such a rich and topic, and the way you've treated it. But one of the key points that came home to me is these guys were not second-rate thinkers. They were very familiar with the other existing competing schools of economic thought, and they're also very familiar with moral philosophy and social philosophy, and how their tariff policy actually impacted on that and had a relationship to it. One thing that I have to ask though, because it surprised me, I would have thought that there would have been already a comprehensive treatment of American protectionist thinking. Why did it fall to an Australian to write such a detailed thesis on the topic?
well, I've been thinking that myself. I think and it's kind of interesting. I was at a couple of weeks ago, I was at the History of Economics conference in the United States. And I was talking to a lot of the well known historians of economic thought there. And of course, I know who Hamilton is and Friedrich List, but they were just kind of, shocked at, all these American thinkers and were just completely unaware. And these are experts in the history of economic thought, but for some reason, at least in the uh, pre-World War pre-World War One era, and going back into the 19th century, it seems like a lot of Americans aren't too interested in their own history of economic thought. Um, but I think what has happened is, and you tend to get this, is you'll have some seminal work in the area, and then all of the other literature which comes along tends to repeat the line in the of this, seminal secondary texts. And in 1876, so the centennial of American independence, there was a article written by an economist called Charles Franklin Dunbar, and so this was the first, I'd say, history of economic thought of the United States, and he pretty much dismissed American economics, saying that it was unoriginal and they didn't develop a comprehensive theory of the political economy. And what you found is that all of the other histories of economic thought that came after that repeated this line. Even Joseph Schumpeter, who some of your viewers might know, he came up with the term creative destruction and those sorts of things. He had a very similar, like the thrust of his economic thought actually echoed a lot of what these American protectionist thinkers were writing, because he writes a lot on innovation and invention. Um, but he pretty much says that Charles Franklin Dunbar was exactly right. What he said hasn't been invalidated by his own study, that the Americans didn't really develop an original theory of the economy. Um, there is one very good work which has been written on American economic thought, which is by Joseph Dorfman, which is uh, The Economic Mind in American Civilization. And it actually does go through and um, uh, uh, documents a number of these thinkers. It's not as extensive as what I go into. Um, and he is less dismissive, but he doesn't actually really unpack their theories. It's more just he's just talking about there was these thinkers throughout American history, and he provides the short biographical sketches on each of them. Um, but I'm not sure. It seems like not too many people had actually gone back to that and picked up a lot of the lot of his work in the area and kind of built upon that. But I think that you've had this issue where you've had this lingering prejudice against early American economic thought because of some seminal texts in the early era in the in the secondary literature that has basically caused this issue and
But
has
I
caused.
understand that I understand that mentality because today in Australia, um, it's almost as though anything before the Hawke Howard, Keating tariff reforms and is considered almost illegitimate. There was a period of darkness before where no one had considered questions about trade, apparently, here. And so I can sort of see the same phenomenon occurring in the United States, where we've agreed now to drop free trade is the answer. And they don't appreciate that questions about trade policy were an absolute live political discussion. I mean, amongst the so many great references, I wasn't aware that James Blaine, who was a Republican presidential candidate, actually had exchanges in the press with William Gladstone about trade and how
Yeah, yeah,
Abraham Lincoln and all these people. I mean, every political figure on Mount Rushmore, even Jefferson towards the end, came out in favor of tariffs. Alexander
yeah.
Hamilton, probably the
And
people.
William McKinley, um, he wrote articles in journals on protection, and he even wrote a book. The book's more of a history of tariff legislation than a book on
Mm,
economic theory, but it
mm.
goes to show just how well versed they were. How many politicians do we get these days that actually write books,
Oh yeah,
economic matters, and those
and,
sorts of
and
things?
let and you have a whole stack of quotes throughout, which are just some of that I'm familiar with, and others I hadn't heard before. And William Harding, President William Harding, a lesser known, slightly controversial president, I guess, he just says, it has been proved again and again that we cannot, while throwing our markets open to the world, maintain American standards of living and opportunity and hold our industrial eminence in such unequal competition. There is a luring fallacy in the theory of banish barrier, barrier of trade, but preserved American standards require our high production costs to be reflected in our tariffs on imports. I mean, these are debates. This is what's the debate that's happening again today, and yet people are sort of, they think Trump's pulling it out of a hat or making it up himself, and they don't appreciate the rich intellectual tradition in the United States, from which these discussions
Yeah,
have come.
because it is one of those areas where Trump is viewed as a maverick in American political history, but actually, at least speaking generally, with the tariffs, it's actually very conventional Republican economic policy.
Until kind of the 70s and 80s where they changed their tune. But Abraham Lincoln, who was obviously big name in Republican politics, he's famous. He famously said, "Give us a protective tariff, and we'll have the greatest country on earth." And abandonment of the protective policy by the American government must result in the increase of both useless labor and idleness, and so in proportion produce want and ruin amongst our people. I mean, he's not a free trader. um,
Yeah, yeah, he's not. And as I mentioned before we started this, Henry Carey,
mm,
um, the leading thinker in this American Protectionist school, was an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. And I mean, Henry Carey, he was vice president of the Philadelphia branch, the Pennsylvania branch of the Republican Party.
Mm,
And I mean, it was formed together by, I mean, there were some northern anti-slavery Democrats that joined with former Whigs to um, establish the Republican Party. So a lot of it was the anti-slavery movement as well. But I mean, the senior partner in that were these basically former Henry Clay tariff Whigs that were, and
mm,
that's why you had the American system, which became Republican policy after, after the slavery issue. Well, also even kind of simultaneous with it because you had the moral tariff, which was increased at the time. And I mean, that's the other thing. A lot of the literature, when they talk about the American system, it's kind of written as it's implied that it died with Henry Clay, but it was actually the Republican Party which actually implemented it
mm.
after the demise of the Whigs.
And it goes. I mean, the big grandfather of the American system is Alexander Hamilton. Your focus in your thesis um, sort of starts with him and talks about some of the thinkers around at the time, but then focuses more on the 19th and early 20th century. But it got me thinking. I mean, who influenced Alexander Hamilton when he famously wrote the paper on manufacturers, which was so influential? I mean, where were his intellectual influences? Where did he get this from?
Well, interestingly, I'm actually writing another paper while working on the book, actually on this question. And what's actually quite interesting is, by the way, the report on manufacturers wasn't Hamilton wasn't the sole author of the report on manufacturers.
Mm.
A lot of people don't realize that there was actually another economist called Tench Cox,
Yeah.
who was an important thinker. Um, and even in that, below them, so both of them worked in the Treasury Department. Alexander Hamilton was, of course, the first US Secretary of the Treasury. Tench Cox was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. There's also another economist called William Barton, who
I saw that.
was a clerk in the Treasury Department. I
Mm,
don't have any direct evidence that Barton actually contributed to the report on manufacturers, by the way. It's just a suspicion because
mm,
some of his arguments in his earlier articles appear in the report on
mm,
manufacturers. But I mentioned that diversity of, natural talents. And I think that's actually one of the most interesting things in the American protectionist literature. And it's something that the later thinkers after Hamilton really pull out and systematize it, um, and
mm.
build upon it more comprehensively. There was actually an earlier, not sure whether I want to give it away because someone might come in and gazump me and take my idea, but there was actually an earlier paper written by Tench Cox where he actually pretty much says the exact same thing as what's repeated in the report on manufacturers, and he wrote it a few years before.
But were they
But
coming this up with it, with them up themselves? I mean, or were they drawing on influences or thinkers from Europe or history, or where did it come from?
you do have the mercantilist thinkers, which came before Hamilton, and
Mm,
I must admit, I'm not super well read on the mercantilist literature.
mm,
Although out of the ones that I know that Hamilton has read, the likes of there's Sir James Stewart is one of them.
mm,
There's also another one called, I'm not sure whether he was actually a mercantilist, but I know that Hamilton had actually read his economic writings, which was Malachi Postlewhite.
okay.
Um, but I have reviewed that literature, and particularly in the case of Stewart, when I read it, I think that that may have been more of an influence on Hamilton's reports on banking and public credit because I don't actually
Mhm.
find Hamilton's arguments for protection to be along the lines of Sir James Stewart. Um, uh,
Interesting, yeah.
Now, it is also clear that there is certainly areas where Hamilton does borrow some ideas from Smith. So Hamilton talks about, we need manufacturing because it's more conducive to the division of labor. And of course,
Mm,
the division of labor was very important to Adam Smith. But so much of the report is actually against Smith. So
mm.
on that diversity of natural talents, which you actually get in The Wealth of Nations and even in some of Smith's earlier writings, such as his lectures on jurisprudence. Adam Smith's actually downplaying natural differences between individuals. He says that we're basically all the same. And the difference in what appears to be natural talents, there isn't really natural talents. It's just due to the division of labor, we have different experiences. That's actually the opposite of what Hamilton argues. Hamilton's actually arguing that there are these natural differences, which is why we
Mm.
want a diversified economy, so we can exercise that.
Yeah. And it
Um,
may just have been, just to speculate, that Britain was a highly protectionist power at the time
mhm.
that it was engaged in its fight with the new Americans, and he would have been familiar with their policies and what they were implementing. And Britain, people
Yeah,
kind of assume that Britain was always a free trade power, but it certainly wasn't at the time Adam Smith was writing. And even as late
yeah.
as like
Well,
the
yeah,
1820s, it had a like a 30 or 40% average tariff on goods coming into the UK. So there's a lot of rewriting of history, or history that's not properly understood when it comes to Britain's example about free trade.
mm. Yeah. And I mean, Adam Smith was writing against mercantilism, so obviously he wouldn't
Yep.
be writing against it if it had already uh,
Mm,
been taken down, basically.
mm.
So he was actually
No.
making the case to abandon this system of
And his
mercantilism.
ideas only really caught on too when Britain reached such geopolitical industrial preeminence that it sort of thought that it didn't need to worry about foreign competition in a sense, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that's something which He-Jun Cheng writes about in
Mm.
his work. So kicking the way the ladder is, Britain
Yeah.
kicking away the ladder because they use these protectionist policies to develop. But then once they develop, they try to convince everyone else that actually it's due to free trade and you should practice free trade with us. And um, the
Yeah.
line actually comes.
I
The line
sometimes
actually
feel with him, he thinks there's some nefarious motive, but actually, like in the current day, people preach free trade because they don't think otherwise. It's not necessarily because it's always in their interest to do so.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that Adam Smith was that was
No,
Adam Smith's intention. I
no.
think he honestly was opposed to mercantilism and wanted to uh, unravel dismantle that system. Although interestingly, it was also the commission of customs later on
No.
in Britain, so which doesn't quite fit that. But of course, it's also convenient if you do have this important thinker like Adam Smith making this argument. It also provides, I guess, intellectual weight for the likes of the British government to. I mean, personally, I don't really find the argument that there's some kind of plot to convince other nations to practice free trade, but it's also not something that I completely dismiss either.
Yeah, interesting. So, what did the American protectionists add to more ancient schools of thought regarding mercantilism, or are they completely different things? Do you think?
I think that there's a very clearly different thrust in the protectionist literature. Now, when we hear the term mercantilism, it's kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different thinkers and a lot of the
Mm,
mercantilists. A lot of conflicting ideas floating around, and that. So this might not necessarily hold for more or for all mercantilist thinkers, but what you tend to find in the mercantilists, they view the economy as as basically a fixed pie, and we need to try and get a larger slice of the pie. Basically, that's why you get this emphasis on running trade surpluses and those sorts of things. So it is very much a static conception of the economy. If you look at the Americans, it's when you think about the infant industry argument and this emphasis on human ingenuity, invention, it's about growing the pie. And even when you look at the writings, a lot of these protectionist thinkers, they don't tend to talk all that much about the bounce of payments and
mm,
trade surpluses. Their emphasis is more, you know, uh, individual ingenuity in industry and those sorts of things. which I
Mm.
think is a very different thrust to what I've
Well,
seen in the mercantilist literature. And that,
you talk
yeah,
about them having a very different conception of man, right? That they see. Um, there's a concern for for the human individual flourishing, and then they
yeah,
don't see simple humans as Homo economist or whatever the term
mhm,
is, and that people have and nations and individuals have control of their own destiny and have the ability to improve and develop and all these that type of ethos pervades this
yeah,
sort of.
yeah. Yeah, because what my sense in the mercantilist literature is you're taking the macro view of the economy more, and it's like this is the national unit, and
Mm,
how do we actually, uh, you know, uh, increase our share of global wealth? Where there is a lot more going down onto the micro level and looking at the individual in the protectionist literature, which is quite interesting because it is
mm,
kind of like this uh, nestling of uh, nationalism with individualism,
mm.
actually, and that does seem to be something very American when you think about it, uh, combining
Well, they were
nationalism and
they were
individual.
they were a democratic society too. I mean, there's certainly stuff in the Tudors and the Elizabethan era where they were very forthright statements about the need to build up the manufacturing industry, but it was probably more to serve the interests, I guess, of the crown or the elite. Whereas the American
Yeah,
protectionists, in my reading of it, weren't, although they're often portrayed as sort of self-interested, there was a genuine kind of um, emphasis on improving the nation and improving the individuals in it.
yeah. Well, I mean, to give you an example of that, now Hamilton did support bounties, although he was kind of cautious with their use. He had various stipulations. Uh, they need to be temporary and those sorts of things. What you actually tend to find is after Hamilton, um, all the protectionists, it was protective tariffs, and are actually opposed to bounties and subsidies. Um, they just,
Bounties meaning what exactly? Bounties is a
uh,
bounty what is it in that context?
it's just another name for a subsidy, basically.
Mm,
So we'll
yeah,
give you a bounty on the amount that you produce, or a bounty
mm,
on that you export.
mm,
So it's a form of subsidy. Um, what you actually find is that after Hamilton, virtually all of the American protectionist thinkers were opposed to subsidies, and it was protective tariffs. And if you actually look at their reasoning behind it, um, it was because with a protective tariff, it protects everyone within the industry. So it's an equal protection to everyone. So you're not discriminating against individual producers. With a subsidy, it usually goes to politically connected firms, the larger and more influential firms in the economy. So subsidies actually create barriers to entry. They argued for new entrepreneurs and
mm.
small, um, you know, um, new entrants to the market. Basically,
Yeah,
that emphasis seems very different to the mercantilist, where it was just about building, national power and those sorts of things, and supporting these politically connected firms. Where you didn't have that in the American system. It was, there was a large emphasis on social mobility, actually. So they were
mm,
concerned with how do we actually lift the workers up and allow workers to become entrepreneurs and capitalists themselves. And that was the reason for tariffs. And it was actually the reason why they were mostly opposed to subsidies as
mm,
well. And I would I would very strongly suspect that you're not going to find that argument in any of the mercantilist literature. I wouldn't think.
mm, mm.
Um, what you actually found, and I mean, Hamilton was actually, I don't know whether he was influenced by any of the thought of Jean Baptiste Colbert, who was the French finance minister at the time. What you actually got under Colbert was a lot of monopolizing of industry. So Colbert was a mercantilist. Um, he was a practitioner as opposed to a thinker, though. And yeah, a lot of his policy regime was monopolizing industries and creating barriers to entry and a lot more regulation, where the Americans didn't accept that. They supported the likes of the tariffs and those sorts of things and investing in infrastructure. but a lot more of that heavy-handed intervention in the economy. They were opposed to that due to these issues such as barriers to entry, and also you know, um, just creating a lot of inefficiencies in the market as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's so important, I think, this point, because tariffs in Australia, and I think across the West, are often portrayed as something that those on the left or believers in big government are supporters of. But that's not actually, or at least it's often portrayed as that's where you'll get to if you start to sort of pull on this tariff thread. But that's not the experience, and that's certainly not what the protectionist thinkers in the United States believed in, right?
Uh, yeah, no, it wasn't. And I mean, the other thing to keep in mind is that tariffs have two functions. The primary function, according to these thinkers, was the protection of industry. The other one was the raising of revenue. And I guess to take a step back, when you look at the American system, there was basically three or four planks, depending on how you formulate it. You had the protective tariffs, which was for both protection but also revenue.
Mm,
You had your infrastructure, or what they called internal improvements, um, and depending on the thinker, a national bank as well. But the other one was basically free internal markets, as in they
mm,
were, and low levels of domestic taxation. I actually saw like the low levels of domestic taxation being linked to the tariff, because if you're raising revenue from the tariff, then it actually uh, means that you can forego domestic taxes,
mm,
so these protectionist thinkers were highly opposed to income tax, for example.
mm. Yeah.
So actually, when you think about it now, unless you're an extreme anarcho-capitalist or something like that, everyone agrees that we need a national government and they need to facilitate the likes of public goods such as infrastructure. Now, you need to collect revenue from somewhere. Does it make sense to collect revenue on income by taxing income and taxing capital, domestic capital? Or does it make sense to actually have consumption taxes on imports? And so there's actually, this was part of their argument that we can actually forego income tax and other forms of domestic taxation by raising revenue on tariffs.
There's this
So,
great there's a great quote, I have to insert it, by Abraham Lincoln, and I'm sure you're familiar with, where he talks about exactly this. He says, "The tariff is the cheapest system. By the direct tax system, the land must be literally," well, he's referring to income tax, "covered with assessors and collectors going forth like swarms of Egyptian locusts. By the tariff, the whole revenue is paid by the customer as foreign goods, and those chiefly the luxuries and not the necessities of life. By this system, the man who contents himself to live upon the product of his own country pays nothing." I mean, it's probably overstating it a little bit,
mm,
but that's their ideal in a sense. No direct taxation on people within this domestic market, but we impose these tariff barriers, and you pay it if you want luxuries or other items that might come in from abroad. And that's not how we operate at the moment.
yeah, and I mean that pretty much is very similar to how Alexander Hamilton expresses
Mm,
it in the report on manufactures.
yeah.
And the other thing is Hamilton, and you actually get this in the protectionist literature, is they argue that actually, and I mean, if you're a libertarian, you might be more inclined to view it this way, is that actually tariffs, when you compare it to other taxes, are actually more conducive to liberty. You
Mm,
know, being a consumption tax, you, you don't get this forced reduction in savings with the likes of income tax. It's only if you actually spend that
mm,
you pay the tax. And it's even more so with the tariff, because you have domestic substitutes. So you can always buy the domestic substitutes and forego the tax. But what they actually, a lot of these thinkers, and you can see it in the likes of Daniel Raymond, who was another thinker in it, he basically says that is a tariff even a tax, or is it just a voluntary charge to exporters to gain access to our market? Because they
yeah.
could always sell somewhere else. So you even get kind of these arguments that are formulated upon almost lines of liberty and those sorts of things in the protectionist literature, which is quite interesting. So there's even I guess, an ethical argument as well as
Yeah,
an efficiency argument.
I often say it's the analogy is not perfect, but it's a little bit. Tariffs are like if you want access to the iTunes platform, where you share the revenue that's generated by marketing within that market. In the same way, the Americans created a market at a national level, but to access it, you obviously there's a cost to that to being involved in it. There's barriers to entry. So, um, one of the points that you make in your thesis is that the American protectionists, and it probably explains why they're not as well known as they should be. They largely operated in exile from formal academic institutions.
Mm.
Can you explain a little bit about that? There were attempts by people like Joseph Wharton to get them of the famous Wharton School of Business, who was very much of the protectionist school, to embody, well, how to say it, establish a more permanent academic footing for these people, but it never really took hold. Can you
Yeah,
explain
so
a bit more about that? Yeah.
so Joseph Wharton, he actually founded the first business school, I believe, in the United States, the Wharton School of
Mm.
Business. As an interesting side note, Donald Trump actually went to the Wharton School of
I did know
Business,
that.
so
Yeah.
it's kind of I don't think there was any protectionist teaching going on at that time. By the way, it's just an
Mm,
interesting anomaly,
mm,
an interesting coincidence. So anyway, yeah, you tended to find that the protectionists weren't. Now, there were some exceptions to the rule. You had the likes of Francis Bowen, who was actually at Harvard, Bender and
mm,
Denslow. I have a paper submitted on him. He was at the old University of Chicago. Um, but yeah, the one of the real attempts to create a permanent home for the protectionists was the Wharton School of Business. So Joseph Wharton founded this school. I can't recall the exact date that he founded it, but even written into the charter. So the Wharton School is part of the University of Pennsylvania. Even written in the charter of the school, Joseph Wharton stipulated that they must teach protectionist economics within this institution.
mm,
Um, and so when he founded it, he appointed Robert Ellis Thompson, who was he was probably the de facto leader of the school in the late 19th century. Robert Ellis Thompson. He became
mm,
the professor of economics at the Wharton School. However, it didn't really maintain its protectionist character very long. You ended up uh, one of the and I think this might be an explanation for the decline of the school. You mentioned about the protectionists being outside of formal academic institutions, which I'll get to. But it was always in the American economic space. It was always this debate between basically your Hamiltonian protectionists and your more, even though Jefferson didn't exactly practice what he preached, these Jeffersonian free traders, basically,
mm,
and that defined American economic thought throughout the 19th century. But what you had towards the end of the 19th century is you had a lot of American students that would go across to Germany to get their PhDs in the German seminaries. And you had another school of thought over there called the German Historical School. Um, Now, some of them did agree with protectionism and those sorts of things because the German Historical School, they were a lot more interventionist than both the protectionists and the free traders in the United States. They supported more social welfare. They supported more industry policy, those sorts of things. What you started to find is when those graduates would come back to the United States, that they became this new force on the scene. And I think because they ended up being in this, now this isn't a hypothesis, so I'm not completely sure
mm,
whether this accounts for the decline of the protectionists. It's still something that I'm working on.
mm,
Um, but it seems like the protectionists started falling by the wayside because the debate wasn't no longer between the Hamiltonian protectionists and the Jeffersonian free traders. It became a debate between the free marketers and these what became known as progressives, which was taking these German doctrines and applying them to the United States. So you had the likes
mm,
of Richard T. Ely, and um, and what actually happened is the University of Pennsylvania wanted more of these because they had PhDs, so academia was becoming more credentialized. They wanted
mm,
to get more of these German-trained academics into their institutions, and eventually they were brought into the Wharton School of Business, and they kind of forced out Robert Ellis Thompson and converted the Wharton School of Business away from this protectionist orientation to a more
mm,
progressive orientation. Basically, that's what happened in the Wharton School of Business. So, and the other thing which I think accounts for the decline of the school is because they didn't really have that much presence in academia, they kind of established this quasi network of like a shadow academic network almost, made up of think protectionist think tanks. You had the likes of the Home Market Club,
mm,
the American Protective Tariff League, and also employer associations, because naturally a lot of these industries had a interest in protectionism. And the two big ones was really the American Iron and Steel Association
mm,
and the Association for Wool Manufacturers. And what you found is, they would produce a bulletin um, each week or each fortnight, whatever it might be. And actually, it was a lot of these protectionist economists were actually editors of the bulletin. And
mm,
this is where a lot of the articles would appear. And this is actually what sustained this protectionist school of thought. Unfortunately, though, when that's the situation where it's mainly outside of academia, you don't have this younger generation coming through of students where you're actually training them in this doctrine, basically.
mm.
So I think that the school of thought kind of ran out of steam because, you didn't have this younger generation coming up and, carrying the torch
But
of
it's
this
sort of a little bit
thought.
like what occurred in the UK too. You can explain it, I suppose, through uh, because the United States became the dominant industrial power.
Hmm.
So in the same way, when Britain became an leading industrial power in the world, it sort of forgot all the lessons it had learnt, which helped it get there. And the United States didn't have a need. It didn't think it had a need anymore for these protectionist or trade barriers that had built up when it was becoming the top dog.
Yeah. Well, you actually raise an interesting point because what I found was because the American Iron and Steel Association still exists, actually. I think it goes by a
Mm,
different name. I think it might be the American Iron and Steel Institute. At least in the early years, that's like when it did change names, then uh, yeah, that's what it was called. Um, Joseph Wharton was actually very involved in this. And what was interesting is after his death, the institution really started changing its character. But just to touch on your point, it seemed that what happened is under the Wilson administration during
mm,
World War One, you tended to have a lot more of this monopolization of industry, um,
mm.
uh, and subsidies and those sorts of things come into practice. These industrial policies, um, and it seems like when that came in, they kind of dropped a lot of this emphasis on protectionism and was more interested in actually these domestic industrial policies that benefited them. So I think
Mm.
even just responding, uh, you know, um, they kind of turned away from protection, which was a cause of a lot of their industry
Mm.
rising in that. And then during the Wilson administration, they were like, actually, we kind of like this where we can actually monopolize these industries and don't need to compete
So,
with other domestic competitors. So
because
they kind of shifted.
Wilson famously was cut the tariff dramatically when he came in and
Yeah,
introduced
that's
the
correct too.
first peacetime income tax in the United States, which dovetails with what we were talking about earlier, and how the protectionists didn't want any income tax but wanted tariffs, and so Wilson did the reverse. But yeah, I can see how that would work. How there would have been genuine rent seeking
Hmm.
at that
Yeah,
juncture, and how it discredited potentially the original more wholesome protectionist thinkers or motives.
yeah. Well, if you remember what I said, that the protectionists were they had a lot of emphasis on social mobility. So
mm,
actually, when you look at them, they weren't that concerned with income inequality as long as there was low barriers to entry and workers had the capacity to actually become capitalists themselves, right?
mm,
So, kind of this monopolization of industry under the Wilson administration, that really doesn't fit the protectionist theory, does it? So,
mm, yeah,
and and I think that these large steel industries, they're like, actually, we kind of like it if we actually have these barriers to entry because it prevents new entrants coming in and competing with us. So I think that was a major shift. And so it was kind of these two things. They didn't have a home within academia, but then you had a lot of these employer associations that basically changed their tune on
mm,
the tariff question. So it seems to be that those factors kind of culminated in the demise of the school,
mm,
at least it seems. But the American Iron and Steel Association, before that, they were huge promoters of these protectionist thinkers. In fact, you mentioned how did I actually stumble across so many? One of the breakthroughs, I guess, when doing this research is I actually found the bulletin of the American Iron and Steel Association. And on the
mm,
back of every issue, you'd go to the back and they'd have books of these different economists for sale. And then
mm.
that's actually how I tracked down a lot of these economists through these catalogs from the American Iron
Yeah.
and Steel Association.
It's just, it's we're not doing it justice in a short hour podcast, but just the names. I mean, Andrew Mellon and Joseph Warden, and these are captains of sort of American industry that we're associated with, and they were firmly in the kind of protectionist school, and we're not. These were not. They were doing it from the best motives, as far as they had. They were from the industry, yes, but it didn't mean that they weren't. That their thinking was unsophisticated, or they're just doing it purely to sort of benefit their own
Yeah,
nest.
I do. I do tend to find a lot of those vested interest arguments. I tend to find them because that's been the other thing with some of the literature on Carey
Mm,
because he had interests in the likes of coal
mm,
and steel and those sorts of things. They just kind of some of them have dismissed it as vested interest, but
mm.
I mean, when you look at the amount that Carey actually wrote, it seems very clear to me he was a true believer. He wasn't just
Yeah,
doing it out of vested interest. But
they were
I mean,
clean. This wasn't propaganda. You read through it, and
yeah,
these are thoughtful people. Yeah.
but a lot you don't apply that same standard actually to a lot of the English free trade writers. When you look
Mm,
at the you had the likes of the Manchester School, for a
mm,
lot of Manchester. It was a huge trading port.
mm,
So naturally, this is where a lot of the free trade thinkers came from. But a lot of that isn't dismissed as vested interests. But when it comes to protectionists, then it's easy just to dismiss it away. When of course, vested interests are going to come into it, but
mm.
a lot of these thinkers, it's very hard to identify any vested interests. I mean, I mentioned John Ray. I cannot see any possible way that John Ray had any personal benefit from encouraging
No,
protectionism.
I'm sure there were people that favoured one ideas or one school of thought compared to the other because of their commercial interests, but there is still a legitimate and bona fide, a sophisticated intellectual debate to be had, and I think you just need to read it through that lens, right? Going through your thesis, and you mentioned so many names. Who was the personality or individual who do you think is the most underrated in terms of their intellectual capacity?
Um, you're kind of putting me on the
Mm,
spot. In terms of probably, it's a bit hard because each for their time, you have these different. You're going to have a natural progression when they're building on
mm,
top of other thinkers, but I might probably mention two. Now, there is some literature on John Ray.
mm.
Um, uh, so he's not as neglected as some of the other thinkers, but I
Who is
think
he?
in terms of he
Who
was
is
the
who?
Canadian but he was clearly building upon this American protectionist tradition.
Mm,
And what you found is a lot of other writers in this tradition would actually make reference to John Ray. So um, I'm confident in actually clearing, even though he was a Canadian, but he did move to the United States for some period of time. and he was involved in the Boston Circle of Protectionists. So I'm confident in actually including him as part of this tradition. Um, I think that he's probably one of the most underrated economists in history, as in he was writing on a lot of the stuff that Joseph Schumpeter was writing on, yet he was doing it, almost 100 years prior to him, talking about
Mm,
invention and technological change. He even came up with his own terminology, inventive versus accumulative growth. And that's very similar to what a lot of modern economists differentiate between, static and dynamic growth. But uh, and I even think that Ray's phrasing of it actually
mm,
makes more sense. I think.
mm,
Um, so he's one of them. The other one I think is an economist called Van Buren Denslow. Um, uh, he seemed very sophisticated for the time, and as far as I can tell, there's only been one article that's ever been written on him, and I currently have an article submitted to a journal, so hopefully that
mm.
gets accepted on Van Buren Denslow. And the reason why I mean, I have a lot of articles to write in this area, but the reason why I prioritize Denslow is actually because I think because he's been so neglected and because he was so sophisticated
Mm,
in my view. So, and
mm,
he has a massive work. It's about 800 pages, his major work on
mm,
economics. So a serious thinker.
mm,
And even what I'm actually, the articles on doesn't really even relate that much to protectionism. It was actually his theory of profit, which I think is quite
mm,
sophisticated. So
mm.
um, those thinkers, although I don't know, it's one of those things where I kind of pick up their work and kind of look a little bit more into it. I'm like, oh, actually, he's a very sophisticated thinker. So
Mm.
you might ask me in a year and I might give you a different answer. But
Okay.
at this point in time, I'd probably suggest those two thinkers, John Ray
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
Van Buren Denslow. Yeah.
And I know we had a little bit of a chat about it offline before we started, but what influence did the American Protectionist School have in Australia? Was there much interaction between us and them in the late 19th century?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the connection between the Australians and the Americans is not something that I've looked deeply into. I did mention that David Syme, is it Syme? He was uh, I haven't read his work, but I recognize the name because I know that some of these protectionist writers in the United States were actually promoting his
Mm,
work. Now, I don't think that Stein
mm,
influenced these protectionist thinkers. I'd probably think it's the other way around,
mm,
and that these Americans uh, saw value in the work, and that's why they were promoting it.
yeah.
So that's one. There is another. He wasn't really an economist, I'd say, but a political thinker, which is I think it was George Ward Cole, and he was this was during the colonial era. He was in Victoria, and he was publishing a number of like pamphlets and articles promoting the ideas of Henry Clay and Friedrich List in
Mm,
Victoria. So there was
mm,
some influence there, and as you'd know, Victoria was actually the most protectionist colony in Australia. And
mm,
after Federation, it took a bit of time, but eventually they ended up adopting the high Victorian tariff
mm.
um, in Australia. So there might be some connection there, but admittedly, I'm probably not as well
Another
versed.
another another area of research. Yeah, I mean, David Syme, for
Yeah.
those who are familiar, was a newspaper proprietor, a backer of Alfred Deakin, and was very much behind well, the Australian system or the Australian settlement, which
Yeah.
included high tariffs and everything else. Final question: what lessons should we learn today by studying this period in American history or this school of thought? What do we need? What should we need to know?
I guess it's a very there's probably quite a lot of things. Let me just think of the best way to articulate it. Something which I try to mention in my thesis, just to maybe encourage people to review the works of the American protectionists with an open mind, is it isn't exactly clear to me that um, the economics that we have today is the best economics. When you look at intellectual history and the history of economic thought, um, you don't have this linear one-way march to more and more correct economic theories, right? Often there are theories which are uh, dismissed in their own time, but then later on, some other economist finds it, and and in the end, they're actually vindicated. So you tend to have a lot of these detours, and so the progression of economics tends to follow more of a zigzag pattern rather than a linear increase. Um, and you can look at, Thomas Kuhn's uh, theory of scientific revolutions and those sorts of things. It's very messy how economics actually progresses. Um, and I'd argue that a lot of the assumptions that we actually have in, mainstream neoclassical economics, they seem very questionable to me. I mean, I have touched on a few times in this talk that diversity of talents, aptitudes, and dispositions. So, everyone's essentially different. So, labor and individuals more broadly are highly heterogeneous. But what you find in mainstream economics literature is, a unit of labor is a unit of labor, or a unit of capital is a unit of capital.
Mm.
So are actually a lot of these assumptions which underpin economics, are they actually the best assumption? Are they actually the assumptions that we should have? Or should we actually look back? And, when you start off with these foundations, it really changes the overall structure of your economic theory.
Mm.
So is the theory that we have today actually the best kind of economic theory, or should we actually go back and review some of these ones which maybe have more realistic assumptions, which are better fit for economics today?
Mm. No, look, it's fascinating, and we've only scraped the surface. You've got a book coming out based on the thesis later this year, right? How do people?
Next
Well,
year,
okay.
yeah, yeah, September 2026, assuming that all the publication goes smoothly. So my book, which is America's Neglected Protectionist Tradition: The Economics That Formed a Nation.
Mm.
Sorry, that forged a nation. Sorry. Um, Yeah, so you might just need to wait until that. In the meantime, if you do search for my PhD thesis, which is American Protectionist Thought, the Economic Philosophy and Theory of the 19th Century American Protectionists, it is plastered around the place. So if you search that into Google, you should be able to find it. Um, and if you search my name into YouTube as well, I have a couple of talks which I've given at different seminars and conferences, which you can also review. Um, yeah,
No,
so
that's
that's how
great.
you can
That's great.
find more.
Great, Matthew. I mean, fantastic to make the connection. And I encourage those who are serious about trade policy to go and read your PhD, because it is a substantial, a substantial work with all sorts of interesting quotes and tidbits. Very readable, and I do think that well, if we're going to sort of think again about what sort of trade policy we should have in the years going ahead, both in Australia and globally, it's going to be an invaluable reference point. So, really enjoyed our discussion, and look forward to keeping in touch. We'll definitely get you back on when your book goes live.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Bye.
Yep.